Hello, welcome to my channel. This is Dr. Emmanuel, and today we'll be doing a revision of the descending tracts of the central nervous system. And this first image is actually extracted from Frank Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy. And in this image, we can see a transverse section of the spinal cord. Okay, and in this transverse section, is being illustrated. The descending tracts have been illustrated using the red color. Okay, on this right side where my cursor is, you can see this red structures, bundles of nerves or bundles of axons. So these are the descending pathways, okay, as depicted by this key. And then the green key, the blue key, represents the ascending pathways. But for the purpose of this video, the purpose of this revision, we'll be doing a revision of just the descending tracts. These descending tracts convey motor axons, okay, motor pathways. So they are actually white matter structures, composed of axons of nerves. And let's just start from this part that is adjacent to the anterior spinal fissure. We can see this is the anterior corticospinal tract. And to the lateral side, we can see we have the lateral corticospinal tract. And the corticospinal tract here has also been called a pyramidal tract. Next to the lateral, adjacent to the lateral corticospinal tract, we have the rubrospinal tract. And we'll get to find out this rubrospinal tract is so named because rubro means red. So it comes from the red nucleus. Here we have a bulboreticulospinal tract. We have the vestibulospinal tract still on the anterior side, anterior part of the spinal cord. And we have the tectospinal tract, which is also called the colliculospinal tract because it arises from the superior colliculus of the midbrain. We'll see that in subsequent images. So let's move ahead. The descending tracts, as we have seen, include the anterior, the lateral corticospinal tracts. We have the corticobulbar, also called the corticonuclear tracts. Now, the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts are called the pyramidal tracts. The other descending tracts constitute the extrapyramidal tracts, and these include the tectospinal, which we said is also called the colliculospinal tracts, the rubrospinal tracts, the vestibulospinal tracts, and the reticulospinal tracts. Okay. Looking at the names of these tracts, let's see. It's actually quite self-explanatory. Corticospinal tracts means corticospinal tracts are, bundles of axons, bundles of nerves, that begin at the primary motor cortex in the cerebral hemisphere, and they end at the spinal cord. That's why it's called corticospinal. Corticobulbar, bulbar there means cranial nerves. Okay, bulbar means the brainstem. Also called corticonuclear tracts. So they start from the primary motor cortex in the cerebral, this will be the frontal cortex, the cerebral hemisphere, and they end at the nuclei of the cranial nerves. The tectospinal or the colliculospinal begin in the superior colliculus of the brainstem or the tectum of the midbrain, and they end in the spinal cord. Rubrospinal, from the red nucleus of the midbrain to the spinal cord, vestibulospinal, and then the reticulospinal tracts. So this image demonstrates the corticospinal tract. And we'll also get to understand why it's called a pyramidal tract, in addition to the corticobulbar. It's called pyramidal because it passes through the pyramid of the medulla. Okay, this is the medulla, and that's the pyramid. Okay, when we looked at the structure of the midbrain, we saw that the medulla has the pyramids, just paramedian, and to the lateral sides of the pyramids, we have the olives. So coming from the motor cortex, where you have the nuclei, you have the axons traversing, going downwards, going through the internal capsule, and then going through the midbrain, going through the pons, going through the medulla. And in the medulla, some of the corticospinal tracts. So you have the anterior corticospinal, some of the corticospinal tracts decussate. Decussate means they move over to the contralateral side. So on this image, we have the fibers on the right side, and some of those corticospinal fibers move over to the left part of the spinal cord. Okay, they decussate to give you the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay. On this plane, it gives anterior corticolateral, corticospinal, and then on this lower plane, you can see it gives you the lateral corticospinal tract. And we said these axons are responsible for movement. Okay, they subserve a motor function. So they move to the limbs, they help, in carrying, motor information from the brain down to the level of the spinal cord so that you're able to move your arms, move your limbs, move your trunk, and other muscles of your body. This is also an image extracted from the internet. I think this previous image, I also found this on the internet, so I just felt it looked quite self-explanatory, so I extracted that. Also extracted this image from the internet. It's just a repetition of what we've seen, but repetition helps to make things clearer. So we'll still look at it. So the precentral gyrus, that's where we have the primary motor cortex, okay? The precentral gyrus, you can see nuclei, and you can see axons originating from there. And this is the midbrain. This is the cerebral crus of the midbrain, cerebral peduncle, cerebral crus of the midbrain. And you can see that the fibers pass through the midbrain, anterior part of the midbrain. They pass through the anterior part of the pons and the anterior part of the medulla. That's where we have the pyramids of the medulla. In the medulla, some of the fibers continue in the ipsilateral part. Some of them decussate. It appears that most of them actually transfer to the other side. And we have the lateral corticospinal tract. This one continues as the anterior corticospinal tract, okay? And they subserve a motor function. Is also the same thing. Lateral corticospinal tracts. So this decussation produces your lateral corticospinal tract. Some fibers will continue in the ipsilateral side, continue downwards as the anterior, still as the anterior corticospinal tracts, anterior lateral corticospinal tracts, okay? See, it says here to skeletal muscles in the distal parts of the limbs, both upper limbs and lower limbs, and even the trunk, muscles of your trunk. This other image is extracted from, I got this from Nupsy Key. Okay, I just found it on the internet, Nupsy Key, and it looks quite good and self-explanatory for the corticobulbar tract. And it still illustrates the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts. So we can see the corticobulbar tract coming from the primary motor cortex, Brodmann area 4, okay? In the frontal cortex, goes through the internal capsule, it goes through the midbrain. We can see it goes through the midbrain, it goes through the pons, okay? And you can see corticobulbar corticonucleus. So you can see it's subserving the cranial nerve. So you can see facial to facial nerve, branch to facial nerve, to vagus nerve, to hypoglossal nerve, okay? To accessory nerve. So you can see it supplies the cranial nerves. It doesn't supply the oculomotor nerve, okay? So it supplies the cranial nerves apart from the oculomotor nerve. You can see it supplies trigeminal, which cranial nerve 5, abducens, and the rest of them, facial nerve, okay? So it subserves the the cranial nerves, and that's the corticobulbar tract. Here we can still see the anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts. Okay, we've already mentioned those. I see it actually looks quite um, self-explanatory and self-illustrative. You can see from the cortex, from the cerebral cortex, passes through the midbrain, passes through the pons, passes through the medulla, goes down into the spinal cord. Okay, yeah. So it makes sense to conclude that the corticobulbar tract is shorter, much shorter than the corticospinal, because corticobulbar subserves cranial nerves, isn't it? So it makes sense that it has to be much shorter than the corticospinal, which also subserves your lower limbs. So tectospinal tract, which you say is also called the colliculospinal tract. And now where we have the colliculus in the midbrain. So that's where we have the midbrain, level of the midbrain, at the back of the midbrain. At the front of the midbrain, we have the cerebral peduncle, so the cerebral crura. Behind, at the back of the midbrain, we have the tectum. In between, we have the tegmentum. Behind, we have the tectum. And on the upper parts of the midbrain, we have those two bulges called the superior colliculi, which are responsible for vision. They play an important role in the visual pathway. So what this tectospinal or colliculospinal tract does is that it helps in coordinating the movement of the head. So movement of the head, which, in regards to movement of the head with regards to your visual perception. So when you're looking, when your eyes, your visual pathways, getting inputs, visual information, and your head is moving, it helps in creating that coordination between your eye movements, the vision, and the movement of your head, So you can see it actually ends in the cervical part of the spinal cord. It doesn't go down. It's majorly involved with head and neck movements, coordinating with vision. Okay, so that's the tectospinal or the colliculospinal. So it starts from the level of the midbrain, superior colliculus, and ends at the level of the cervical spinal cord. It doesn't go down to the thoracic spinal cord or the lumbar spinal cord. It just ends in the neck, cervical spinal cord. That's where it ends. Okay, it's a short descending tract with tectospinal tract. Okay, and on this same image, we can see the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts. They're also short tracts. Okay, that's the medial reticulospinal, and that's the lateral reticulospinal tracts. They're also part of the extrapyramidal, which means they play that important role in coordination of movements also. This image is also extracted from NIPSI, and on this particular image, we can see the rubrospinal tracts. Okay, the red nucleus. So rubro means red, and this rubrospinal tract is also short. It emerges from the contralateral red nucleus of the midbrain. If you look at that, this is the level of the midbrain. The rubrospinal tract, trace it, that's this one. It doesn't get to the cerebral cortex, or it doesn't come from the cerebral cortex. It comes from the midbrain. We have the red nucleus of the midbrain, which is just adjacent to the substantia nigra. And if you look at the video on the basal ganglia, you will see we made mention of the substantia nigra that produces dopamine. I mean, on that image of the midbrain, you will see the red nuclei. You see both of them, okay? So from the red nucleus on the contralateral side, the rubrospinal tract comes. You can see it crosses over to the contralateral side and then rolls down through the pons, through the medulla, and gets to this lower part of the cervical spinal cord. So it terminates in the lower part of the cervical spinal cord. And it also helps in coordinating movement of the upper limbs, okay? Flexor and extensor muscles of the upper extremities. Helps in coordinating movement of the upper limbs. So we've come to the end. I think let's just go back and do a very quick summary. So in summary, we have these anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts, and we have the corticobulbar or corticonuclear tract, which constitutes the pyramidal tracts. They are called pyramidal because they pass through the pyramid of the medulla. Corticospinal, corticonuclear, they pass through the pyramid of the medulla. All other descending tracts do not pass through the pyramid, so they are called extra pyramidal, which means outside the pyramid of the medulla. And these include the tectospinal, as we've seen, coming from the superior colliculum. And because of that, it's also called the colliculospinal tract. We've seen the rubrospinal, which comes from the red nucleus of the midbrain and terminates at the lower cervical spinal cord level. We've seen the vestibulospinal. From the name vestibular has to do with balance, okay? And reticulospinal. So they play important roles in regulating, regulating motor function. So vestibulospinal plays an important role in regulating motor function as regards balance. Okay, same as reticulospinal. So they're all parts of the extrapyramidal descending tracts. I think we've come to the end of this revision of the descending pathway or descending tracts of the midbrain of the central nervous system. If you think it's been helpful, kindly like, subscribe, and share this video. Thanks a lot.